When I was in elementary school, I spent a lot of time reading. I remember having scholastic book fairs and trying to get my hands on as many books as I could. While Goosebumps was my favorite, I always held another series in high regard, Animorphs. Even if I never really was able to read all the books, because hot dang, there's a lot of them. Animorphs was pretty different from any other series I had read to this point. And not just because it had this really cool thing in the corners where it would have a character morph into an animal if you flip the pages quickly, but because it was dark at times. It was weird. It tackled some relatively mature topics. It was really weird. It showed us the effect of war and the loss of innocence on those who fight. And honestly, it was really fucking weird. Hey everyone, 10K Bill here, your 53rd favorite YouTuber and your best friend. Recently, I've been going down a rabbit hole and looking back at a series that I remember loving and being really into, but I didn't remember a lot about aside from, the obvious. And let me tell you, Animorphs was honestly insane. If you haven't read this, you're missing out on some really wild stuff for a kid's book. So let's take a look at the story of Animorphs and see just how a story about children who can turn into animals and were fighting an intergalactic war went kind of off the rails. Let's start with a really quick overview of the plot. And just a heads up, there's a lot of, we'll say, complicated names in this series. So the main conflict revolves around a group of 5 teenagers and 1 alien from a species called the Andalites, who all have the ability to morph or shapeshift into various animals or creatures. With this power, these teenagers are turned into child soldiers by the Andalites and engage in ferocious, deadly warfare with this parasitic invasion of the body snatcher style alien civilization. Okay, that's kind of weird but relatively simple, right? The series doesn't necessarily focus in on the specifics of the war all the time, but rather it looks at how the war is affecting those involved in it. The, again, literal child soldiers. Which is honestly kind of dark and mature for the book's core audience, young adults or children. That's kind of the broad strokes for the series, and each book either pushes the plot along a bit or gives us some kind of backstory. There's one plotline that I remember very distinctly, and some people who I talked about the series had remembered as well. That's the story of Tobias. Tobias, one of the main teenagers, stays in his animal form for too long. As a result, he becomes stuck as a red-tailed hawk, unable to return to his human form and unable to morph into anything else. Which is dark. But don't worry, that's just the beginning. Because Tobias, while stuck as a hawk, still has his mind, but he feels like he's kind of losing it, eventually giving in to his newly acquired hawk instincts and killing and eating a rat. This kind of breaks Tobias, who decides to attempt suicide, flying into windows, walls, and a skylight. Though Tobias would be unsuccessful, and he kind of makes his peace with being stuck as a bird. But it turns out that wouldn't be forever. Tobias eventually regains his ability to morph from the Elemist. Okay, wait, let's pause here and explain who that is. The Elemist originally was a small winged alien who escaped his doomed planet with the last surviving members of his species. But during their escape, they passed by a nearby moon and their ship was pulled in by a strange tentacle monster named Father. Father had absorbed the brains and collective knowledge of every creature who had passed by the moon, though he became lonely and let the Elemist live and keep him company. The Elemist eventually manages to kind of download the collective minds of the millions that Father had absorbed, fused his body with a spaceship, and became a borderline omnipotent being, essentially a god in this universe. So anyways, the Elemist ends up sending Tobias back in time to right before he got the ability to morph, and gives him the option to either warn himself and avoid getting the ability to morph at all, or simply take a human form from his past self and live as a human a little less than 2 hours at a time. Tobias chooses the latter. So that's kind of a lot. And it all happened by the 13th book of the series. Not even halfway through the series' total run, and we've introduced time travel and God. But let's focus on the time traveling a bit more. The Time Matrix, the in-series time machine, is featured most heavily in the book Elfanger Secret, one of the 4 companion books that were released alongside the main series books. But to be clear, these are canon as far as I can tell. So one of the big bads in the series has taken over the body of a human who just so happened to have recently found the Time Matrix under the pyramids. Because of course that's where it was. This leads to the enemy rewriting the Earth's history to make the planet easier to conquer. Which, I mean, just go back and mess up some early humans. Kick a caveman or something. Why use this overly convoluted plan? Anyways, messing with the timeline leads to some authoritarian aspects overtaking a lot of modern day life. For instance, Jake, the kind of de facto leader of the group, has some, how do I say this without being demonetized? Ideologies very much in line with the bad guys from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The book is pretty on the nose about this. In yet another main character, Rachel, is sent to a re-education camp. From here, the main characters are all given the personalities and memories of their original timeline, and they chase the villain throughout all of time, trying to right the wrongs that are being done. We see them save Albert Einstein's life. They're at the crossing of the Delaware where Jake is actually shot in the head and killed. And then finally, they end up in World War II. Now, if I were going to ask you what you would do if given a time machine, I think a lot of people would have a similar answer. Go back in time and stop Hitler. It's not exactly a bold or controversial stance. So when they turn up in 1940s Germany and are face to face with a man, Tobias has decided to do just that. But in this altered timeline, he's not the leader of the country. He's just a soldier, just a driver. At least that's the argument that Cassie kind of puts forward. Yes, in their and our timeline, he was a genocidal dictator, but here he's just a low-level soldier. But I mean, at the end of the day, he's still a known enemy of Indiana Jones. Tobias does end up killing him, mostly by accident, with Tobias accidentally slitting his throat after he's shot. Kind of a, whoops, we killed Hitler. This is all happening during D-Day, which they also experienced. You know, one of the most violent battles in history. They were just kind of there. We'll touch back on this in a bit. At the end of the day, the group goes to the 60s and eventually prevents the main villain that the man has taken over from being born by keeping his parents from meeting, and the timeline gets reset, with Jake actually being resurrected and the teen heroes keeping their memories from this brief alternate timeline. This has some really dark implications when you start to think about it. For starters, Jake most likely remembers dying. There's also the thought process that they would remember their entire lives, like being indoctrinated by that society and everything. But what's more important is the PTSD that all of them would definitely have from being at D-Day, where somewhere around 10,000 people died. In fact, PTSD and the way that war can change someone is a huge part of the series. Throughout the series, we see the cast all become more callous and indifferent to death. And by the end of the series, it's really taken a toll on some of them. Jake is the prime example of this. Let's jump ahead to the finale. Jake has a plan to finally end the war that involves sacrificing a huge amount of soldiers for a distraction, something that wouldn't have even been thought of at the beginning of the series. Jake also sends his cousin, Rachel, to kill his brother, Tom, who had been taken over at the beginning of the series. Rachel ends up dying. But the war is ultimately brought to an end during this conflict, and not everyone gets a happy ending. Jake, who commits genocide by killing millions of unarmed Yeerks, the parasitic alien creatures that I mentioned earlier, suffers from some pretty major PTSD. At this point, he really only feels at peace when in some kind of conflict. That's even how the series ends for him, with Jake, now older, going off into his next war. Tobias is unable to forgive Jake for ordering Rachel to her death. Some of the other characters are relatively happy, but it's still a pretty dark ending for a children's book series. You can really see the series shift from what was originally an, at least partially, light-hearted Monster of the Week series into this really wide-spanning epic that looks at the intricacies of how war can affect those who are forced to fight. How being forced into a leadership position can shape how someone views themselves. How to find acceptance within yourself. And how not to lose yourself when going through something difficult.